Hello, I'm Gabriela Sanchez Soto, a research scientist at HERC. Thank you for joining me as I present results from our Career and Technical Education project. Today, I'm sharing findings on employment and earnings for CTE graduates from the 2013-2014 to the 2018-2019 high school graduating cohorts in Texas and in the Houston area. Before discussing the findings in this presentation, let me outline our forthcoming series of CTE presentations and our planned release dates throughout January 2022. Today, we are presenting findings for the first in our series of CTE presentations, including findings on CTE participation, employment status, and earnings post-graduation. Our next presentation on January 11th will expand on employment and earnings for CTE graduates by enrollment in post-secondary institutions. On January 18th, we will present on employment and earnings outcomes as they relate to CTE clusters and the industry of employment for graduates. Lastly, our presentation series will culminate in our winter CTE regional meeting, taking place on January 25th, 2022. In this meeting, we will present on how employment and earnings are associated to student characteristics and CTE characteristics. In this presentation, we are focusing on two research questions. Is CTE participation connected with being employed after graduation? And for those who are employed, is CTE participation connected with earnings after high school graduation? To conduct our analysis, we use information from the University of Houston's Education Research Center for 6 high school graduation cohorts in Texas from 2014 to 2019. We match this information with employment records from the Texas Workforce Commission by fiscal year. Using these records, we looked at employment and earnings for high school graduates 1 year and 5 years after they graduated. For our study, CTE participation was defined according to the state's definitions. Specifically, that means we classified students in the following categories. Participant, a student who receives 1 CTE credit in any program. Explorers, a student who takes 1 or 2 CTE courses and receives fewer than 2 CTE credits in any program. Concentrators, a student who completes 2 or more CTE courses and receives 2 or more CTE credits in the same program. And completers, a student who completes 3 or more CTE courses and receives 4 or more CTE credits in the same program, and at least one of those courses is a higher level course. Now, let me summarize the key findings of this presentation. First, we find that nearly all high school graduates in Texas took at least 1 CTE course, and over 2/3 of them are either a CTE concentrator or completer. Second, 1 year after high school, students classified as CTE concentrators or completers were more likely to be employed, work year-round compared to seasonally, and have higher yearly earnings in Texas compared to students with no CTE participation and to CTE participants and explorers. Lastly, 5 years after graduation, CTE concentrators and completers are more likely to work year-round in Texas compared to other graduates. The prevalence of CTE participation in Texas and in the Houston area is high. In Texas, only 9% of graduates had no CTE participation at all. 18% of graduates were either participants or explorers, and 73% were concentrators or completers. In the Houston area, 12% were non-CTE participants, 21% were CTE participants or explorers, and 67% were concentrators or completers. Now we will present our findings on employment and earnings by CTE participation. As I mentioned before, we match the information of high school graduates to employment records from the Texas Workforce Commission for the 5 years after graduation. The employment data is reported for each quarter of the year, and we collapse it by fiscal year to see whether graduates were employed and whether they were employed year-round, meaning for 4 quarters of the year. The TWC collects the earnings and industry of employment for every job reported by an individual every quarter of the year. This data is collected for workers who are formal employees, and thus our limitation is that it excludes activities such as informal work or gig economy jobs. In addition, as the TWC data is only for the state of Texas, it does not include records for Texas graduates who left the state. Despite this limitation, the TWC data remains the best available source to connect employment and earnings to high school graduates in the state of Texas. This graph shows the proportion of high school graduates who are working any number of quarters in the year on one side and those who are working year-round on the other side, 1 year after graduation for Texas and for the Houston area by CTE Participation. As we can see, for both Texas and the Houston area, CTE Concentrators and Completers have higher proportions working 1 year after graduation relative to other graduates. Furthermore, they work year-round at a higher rate than any other graduates. In this figure, we show the median earnings of high school graduates 1 year after graduation for Texas and for the Houston area. CTE concentrators and completers who were employed in Texas have higher median earnings relative to other graduates 1 year after graduation. Median earnings range between a little under $11,000 to close to $12,000 across CTE participation categories. In Texas, the differences in wages goes from about $1,000 between concentrators and completers versus non-CTE graduates and $800 between CTE concentrators and completers versus participants and explorers. These differences are about $700 in the Houston area. There is a great deal of variation in the earnings of high school graduates right after graduation. So to better understand it, our presentation series will continue to explore trends in earnings across multiple dimensions, such as graduates' CTE career clusters and the industries in which they work. Here, we compare the proportions of graduates who are working year-round 1 and 5 years after graduation. A higher proportion of CTE concentrators and completers were working year-round 1 year after graduation, and this advantage continues even 5 years later. Around 50% of concentrators and completers were working year-round in Texas 5 years after graduating from high school, compared to 39% of non-CTE students. In the Houston area, 45% of CTE concentrators and completers were working year-round in Texas 5 years after high school graduation, compared to 35% of non-CTE students. About half of CTE concentrators and completers were engaged year-round in the Texas economy 5 years after graduation, the most of any of the CTE groupings. In later presentations, we will further explore how these patterns of employment relate to other CTE cluster participation, to industry of employment, and to post-secondary education. This figure shows the median earnings of high school graduates in Texas and in the Houston area 5 years after graduation. While CTE graduates earn more 1 year after graduation, differences in median earnings largely disappear 5 years after, though there is still a very slight advantage for CTE concentrators and completers relative to other graduates. However, there are no meaningful differences in median earnings by CTE participation at this point. It is worth noticing that overall, there's an increase in median earnings for high school graduates compared to the first year after high school, with median earnings being close to $25,000 annually. For reference, the lower left corner of this slide shows the median earnings in 2019 for Texas and the Houston area, which are around $35,000 to $37,000 respectively. In our next presentations, we will further examine differences in earnings 5 years after graduation, by CTE cluster, by industry, and by post-secondary enrollment. To wrap up, let me summarize the main takeaways for this presentation. Nearly all high school graduates took at least one CTE course. 2/3 were at least concentrators or completers. 1 year after high school graduation, CTE concentrators and completers were more likely to be employed, be working year-round, and to earn more in Texas. 5 years after high school graduation, CTE concentrators and completers were more likely to be working year-round in Texas. As I mentioned before, in future presentations, we explore more about how employment and earnings are related to CTE cluster participation, to being enrolled in college, and to the industry where graduates are employed. Next in our CTE presentation series, we will look at employment and earnings outcomes by post-secondary enrollment. As I mentioned before, we will also look at how CTE cluster and industry of employment relate to employment and earnings in our third presentation. Lastly, our winter regional meeting on January 25th, 2022 will feature a look at how employment and earnings are associated with student characteristics and CTE characteristics. Thank you for your attention. Please contact us if you have any questions or additional comments related to this presentation or to the CTE project in general. We look forward to your feedback. Thank you.